case the aircraft radios are unusable, it allows you to communicate with overflying aircraft as well as search and rescue teams.
One of the last things that you need to do for any flight, and especially a mountain flight, is make a good go, no-go decision. If you have the slightest doubt, don't go. Too many pilots have been killed because they couldn't miss one good day of skiing. All right, let's go ahead and plan the cross-country from Jeffco to Aspen. But unlike the video, we'll go from Kremling to Glenwood Springs and then to Aspen. And one of the things we want to work on is picking out some distinguishable checkpoints. In the mountains, it's difficult to recognize the same corresponding features on the ground. Your flight plan looks good. Let's call for an outlook briefing. Then tomorrow morning, we'll call for a standard briefing. If everything looks good, we'll go ahead and fly the route.
Good afternoon. I'd like an outlook briefing on a VFR flight from Jeffco to Aspen. Good morning, sir. I'd like a standard weather briefing on a VFR flight from Jeffco. I'd like to file a VFR flight plan. November 423 Charlie Charlie.
Sure picked a beautiful morning for this flight. Okay, one of the first things we have to do is find Corona Pass. But in the meantime, let's make a few turns, get some altitude before we reach the pass. Notice that Corona is listed on the sectional, and it has a 12,940-foot peak to the north and a 13,294-foot peak to the south. See that ridge straight ahead? That's where we'll cross Corona Pass. Now we can verify this is Corona Pass by checking to see if we're approaching Vector 8, which is the 26HB radio from Denver.
While flying in the mountains, it's a good idea to fly as high as practical, keeping in mind the limitations of the airplane and the oxygen requirements. Where practical, many experienced mountain pilots maintain a minimum of 1,000 feet of terrain clearance within 3 miles of their position. This should help guard against encounters with rough air and provide enough altitude to glide to lower terrain in case of an emergency. If the wind speed increases, so should your altitude. For example, in a 20-knot or greater wind, you might want to increase your terrain clearance to 2,000 feet. At times, however, it's going to be impossible for you to fly at high altitudes. If this is the case, there are several techniques and precautions to be aware of. Situational awareness is very important. Knowing where you are, where you're going, and where your escape routes are may make the difference between surviving an emergency or not.
It's very important in mountain flying to always keep track of your position. If you lose track of where you are, you could easily end up lost. One way I check myself is by comparing my desired magnetic heading to my actual heading. For instance, when we go from Glenwood Springs to Aspen, we'll be flying a heading close to 130. If our heading was 090, we could be flying up the wrong valley. Look ahead of you. See all the emergency landing sites? That's the biggest reason for selecting this route, along with the fact that we can now descend to a lower altitude. Now that we've crossed Corona Pass, our next checkpoint is Kremling. Notice the mountain ridge just southeast of Kremling. We want to fly towards that ridge.
While flying in areas with rising terrain, one of the first things you'll have to adapt to is a different reference for the horizon. Many pilots new to mountain flying tend to use the tops of the mountains as the horizon reference. This causes them to fly in a nose-high or climb attitude. To maintain a level flight attitude, you need to superimpose the horizon at the base of distant mountains. You will also want to occasionally cross-check the instruments to make sure the aircraft is performing the way you want it to, and to detect problems as soon as they occur. Another consideration in mountain flying is the visualization of up and downdrafts. As wind flows perpendicular to a ridge or mountaintop, it has a tendency to flow uphill on the windward side and downhill on the downwind side. By knowing the wind direction, you can get a pretty good idea where the updrafts and downdrafts are located. But keep in mind that this is all theoretical, and any obstructions, such as smaller mountains, can cause downdrafts and turbulence even on the windward side. If you encounter an updraft, allow the airplane to climb unless there's a good reason for staying at your altitude.
One reason for staying at this altitude is the oxygen requirement. If we go above 14,000 feet, we're going to have to use oxygen. So let's try to maintain our altitude.
Remember, as you level off or try to maintain altitude in an updraft, your airspeed increases since you're actually descending through the air mass. Be cautious that you don't exceed any aircraft limitation. Whenever possible, avoid the areas where downdrafts might exist. Again, visualization is the key to achieving this goal. However, if you encounter sink, your primary concern is probably terrain. If you happen to get into a downdraft, having enough altitude to fly through it is very important. After applying full power, go to and hold the best rate of climb airspeed. Remember, VY changes with altitude. If this isn't working, try maneuvering to an area where the sink might not be as great. Always retain the ability to turn your aircraft while descending. If it becomes apparent that you will make contact with the ground, continue flying the airplane, and whatever you do, don't pull back on the control wheel trying to gain altitude. In most cases, this will result in a stall. It's much better to make contact with the ground while still in control of the airplane than to stall and possibly spin. Just as visualization is the key to avoiding sink, it also is important for avoiding turbulence. The important thing to remember when you do happen to encounter turbulence is to stay at or below maneuvering speed. This ensures that the wing will stall momentarily before the aircraft suffers structural damage. Maneuvering speed, or VA, should be calculated for each flight based on the aircraft's weight. But remember to reduce it during the flight as fuel is burned. Now, let's see how this knowledge of updrafts, downdrafts, and turbulence can help us during ridge crossings and when flying in valleys. Again, visualization of the airflow based on the prevailing conditions will be important as you make ridge crossings. When crossing a ridge, select a heading that allows an escape route if something goes wrong. Normally, you should cross it at an angle of approximately 45 degrees. This allows you to quickly get to lower terrain by just making a 90-degree turn. If you were approaching the ridge straight on, you would have to make a 135-degree turn to get to the same location. As you near the ridge, you want to make sure that you're high enough to cross. You can easily determine if you're high enough by observing the terrain beyond the ridge. As you get closer to the ridge, you should see more and more of the terrain on the other side. When you can glide to lower terrain on the other side of the ridge, you can commit to the crossing. At this point, turn to depart the ridge at a 90-degree angle. This decreases your exposure time over the ridge and puts you over lower terrain as quickly as possible.
All right, the river down here straight ahead, that's the Colorado River. It kind of curves around the crumbling area. We have a lot of potential landing spots along the river valley. A lot more than if we were flying over the mountains to the south or to the north. This is the primary reason why we're flying down the river valley. The winds can also be a little turbulent down inside the valley. So it's very important that you know which direction the winds are from. This way you can visualize the wind flowing down one side and then up the other. This will also enable you to fly where there will most likely be updrafts and avoid those areas where there might be downdrafts.
When flying in the valleys, try to take advantage of the updrafts and try to avoid the areas of downdrafts. As we've seen before, the prevailing winds can cause areas of lift and sink, but convective activity can also produce up and down drafts. For example, flying in shaded areas, above water, or over heavily forested areas will most likely put you in a downdraft, as cool air over these areas sinks and replaces the warm, rising air. On the other hand, flying over areas where heating is taking place, such as an outcropping of rocks, may produce an updraft. Another consideration when flying in valleys is that terrain can often outclimb an airplane. Therefore, you must always leave yourself an out. This means being able to turn to lower terrain at all times and to never proceed up a blind canyon where there's no escape route. Just like any cross-country flight, you need to stay abreast of the weather. In the mountains, this is extremely important, but not always easy to do. Where possible, use Flight Watch to check on weather conditions along your route. When you can't reach Flight Watch on the standard frequency of 122.0, you may find it necessary to communicate using a remote communications outlet, or RCO. These communications outlets are depicted on sectional by an encircled.
Oh yeah, more money.
There is also a communications box showing the frequency, remote name, and a monitoring flight service station. RCOs extend the range of flight service stations in mountainous terrain and operate in the same manner as other radio stations. Be sure you mention what frequency or facility you're using when you contact the FSS. You can also use Unicom along the route to get local weather information. However, unless the person on the other end is a trained weather observer, the most you will probably get is winds and altimeter setting. Perhaps your best source of weather information in the mountains is pilot reports. Because there are few weather reporting stations in the mountains, flight service stations and other pilots depend heavily on PIREPs. You can obtain and file PIREPs through Flight Watch, RCOs, centers, or by talking to flight service over VORs and other flight service frequencies.
Okay, did you notice that area of lower terrain up ahead? Well, when we reach that area, we're going to want to turn west to get to Glenwood Springs. Alright, when we get to Glenwood, you're going to discover that operations at high-altitude airports differ from the airports you're used to flying into.
Some airports, for reasons of terrain, noise abatement, or runway slope, are one-way airports. This means that traffic has only one way in and out. For example, here at Glenwood Springs, if the wind permits, pilots are to use runway 32 for arrivals and runway 14 for departure. When operating at any airport, and especially a one-way airport, turn on your landing lights and anti-collision lights if they are not already on. This makes it easier for traffic approaching from the opposite direction to see you. As we've already seen, mountains can create unusual wind flow patterns. Therefore, it's important to assess wind conditions as well as turbulence and obstructions caused by the surrounding terrain as you approach to landing. While you assess these conditions, you should also plan for a go-around in case something happens and you can't complete the landing. While you're beginning the go-around is not the time to be making these decisions. Another thing to consider is that if the airport you're flying into allows for a traffic pattern, chances are you'll overshoot the turn to final, especially if this is your first attempt. This is because your true airspeed is higher at the higher elevations, even though your indicated airspeed is the same. But don't slow down to compensate for the increase, because the higher true airspeed is needed for the wing to produce the same amount of lift as it would at lower altitudes. Instead, widen your pattern proportionally as your altitude and true airspeed increase.
Okay, now that we're approaching Glenwood Springs, Want to keep an eye out for traffic that's departing in the opposite direction. This is normally a one-way airport. It's also important that we set our mixture according to the manufacturer's recommendations for high-altitude approaches. We also want to make sure that we fly the approach at the recommended approach speed. Remember, landing distances are based on you flying that airspeed. Now that we've landed, let's taxi to the end of the runway. We'll turn around and take off back down the valley towards Aspen.
Conditions permitting, after you've taken off from a one-way airport and have attained a safe altitude, you might want to offset the takeoff leg. This will help avoid other traffic on pilot.
Okay, this is the Aspen Valley. We want to try and stay to the right side. If aircraft coming out of Aspen stay to their right, we should have separation. Also, with the current winds, we can take advantage of any updrafts by staying on this side.
Covered a lot of information during this mountain checkout. But remember, mountain flying can be very rewarding as long as you take the time to review the information that we've covered, such as proper pre-flight planning. Remembering that your aircraft may experience some loss of performance, keeping track of your weather, also remembering how to operate your aircraft during high-density altitude situations. There's one thing that you've done that I wish a lot of other pilots would do, and that's take the time for a proper mountain flying checkout. Flying at this altitude is much different from flying at lower elevations.
Yes, I've done that.
Through proper training, we could eliminate a lot of the accidents that occur during mountain flying. And there are a lot of pilots who come up here to see the beautiful scenery that we saw today.